sexy guys do. Explore what's all in their minds. Yeah, about a thing or two, about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no taking back would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark, and I'm going to be your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, sometimes the headlines are predictable and sometimes they surprise you. And this week's topic was inspired by some surprising headlines that I've seen recently, which is that you and I probably had a shared experience growing up, which is that the common understanding, the common expectation was that eventually human population would reach unsustainable levels and then everything would collapse.
Yes.
It was described as a ticking time bomb.
Yes.
From that frame of reference, too much fertility is a bad thing. But lately I've been seeing something more surprising, which is persistent headlines about too little fertility being a bad thing, where in Western societies in particular, our fertility rate has dropped below the point that we're replacing the population, and therefore we're not producing the hardworking capitalists of the future. And this is supposed to lead to inevitable collapse, and something must be done about it. And so I'm curious, is it a situation where we're damned if we do or damned if we don't? Like fertility is both good and bad at the same time. Is there some magic number that societies should be aiming for, or is this too low fertility thing a little bit overblown? So as usual, I handed this question off to you to investigate on my behalf, and I look forward to hearing what you learned.
Yeah, boy, Mark, all your questions are interesting. Really, I say that with absolute sincerity. But I did probably more reading on this one than any other one you've ever asked me because it was so freaking interesting. This question is about demography, which is the statistical study of human populations. That's a numbers-heavy field, and I think you can't talk coherently about it without citing some of those numbers. So I want to apologize in advance to you and our listeners, but I'm going to present a barrage of numbers and percentages in the first part of my presentation. Then I'll discuss the implications of all those numbers in the second part. Okay, so let's start with that Goldilocks just right number that you referenced in your question when you articulated it to me last time. And that number is called replacement level fertility. In developed countries like ours, it's 2.1, meaning the average number of children born to women in their reproductive lifetimes must be 2.1. for the population of developed nations to remain stable from one generation to the next, with neither growth nor decline.
And may I infer that the 0.1 part of that is to account for children who pass away for whatever reason before they reach reproductive age?
Yes, the 0.1 accounts for lingering child mortality, which of course is much lower than it used to be, and the premature deaths of some women before they reach reproductive age.
Yeah.
But full disclosure for our mansplaining audience, my wife and I had 2 kids, which means we're 1/10 of a child below average, which is annoying to us because we think of ourselves as well above average in every other respect.
Well, you came so close. By contrast, my wife and I have 0 children. In fact, I have 2 older sisters, and the 3 of us together produced a grand total of 2 children. So as a family, we are well below average.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, so you're living proof for the very phenomenon that you asked me to investigate today.
Indeed.
Now, I also want to point out the replacement level for the developing world is higher than 2.1 because fewer women reach childbearing age in poorer countries. But my headline for this episode is that the fertility rate is unlikely to land on the Goldilocks number, and I'm going to try to explain why. But before I do that, let's talk a bit about population and fertility rates over time. For most of human history, the world's population was well under 1 million people, and population growth was a non-issue. As recently as 12,000 years ago, there were fewer than 4 million people on Earth. The population growth rate between then and the year 1700 was only 0.04% per year.
Mm.
The demographer Warren Thompson developed a framework for thinking about this called the demographic transition model, consisting of 4 stages. He described the period between the dawn of humanity and the 18th century as stage 1, which he called pre-industrial, characterized by high birth and high death rates that essentially cancel each other out. That's why the population increased so slowly. The world's population exploded in the 250 years since the start of the Industrial Revolution, as richer nations entered stage 2 of Thompson's model, which he called urbanizing/industrializing, in which birth rates remain high, but the death rate starts to decline. The apogee of the population explosion came in the late 19th and 20th centuries, which is also when much of the developed world reached stage 3, mature industrial, so the name of that stage, with birth rates starting to fall as death rates continued to decline. In 1927, the world's population reached 2 billion people. Global population growth peaked at 2.3% in 1963, the year I was born. Today, it's less than 1%, even though there are about 8 billion people walking the planet. The quadrupling of the global population in less than a century is due to improvements in health and living conditions that reduced mortality rates, especially in children, while greatly increasing life expectancy. And that, I think we can agree, is a good thing.
Yeah, sure.
Now, according to a study recently published by the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington and published in the medical journal The Lancet, the global fertility rate in 1950 was 4.84, but plummeted to 2.7 in the year 2000 and 2.23 in 2021. Stage 4 of Thompson's model, the post-industrial society, is the leveled off, stable population that occurs when death rates remain in decline while the birth rate is at or just above the Goldilocks number of 2.1. The U.S. and the rest of the developed world reached stage 4 in the first half of the 20th century, right before World War II. The post-war baby boom reversed some of those trends, with fertility rates temporarily rising back to where they had been at the turn of the 20th century. But that was an anomaly, basically a one-generation historical blip before fertility rates started declining again. Today, there are still some African nations with fertility rates above 5, and I'll say more about that a little later. But most of the world has converged at numbers under 3 or even 2. In fact, 46% of the nations in the world already had a fertility rate below replacement level in 2021, with South Korea the lowest at 0.82. The Lancet study projects sub-replacement fertility to increase to 97% of the world by the end of this century, with just 6 countries above 2.1. Most of the developing world is now in stage 3, but the developed world and even some developing countries have moved beyond stage 4, which was the last stage envisioned by Warren Thompson, the post-industrial society. The consensus among demographers is that this new stage 5 will be marked by an indefinite period of sub-replacement level fertility, though a minority argues that birth rates may rise again for complicated reasons we don't have time to discuss today. Let's just stay with the consensus, which is that we're entering these uncharted waters of indefinite sub-replacement fertility.
Yeah.
Demographers expect the human population to peak at between 9.7 and 10.4 billion people sometime between 2064 and 2086, at which point the world's fertility rate is expected to be around 1.59, which is way below our Goldilocks number of 2.1. And thus will begin an era of negative population growth, an oxymoron meaning that the world's population will start shrinking. When that happens, Mark, it will be the first global loss of population since the Black Death bubonic plague outbreak in the 14th century.
Wow.
And just in case you're wondering, because I wondered this, although the COVID pandemic killed nearly 16 million people in 2020 and 2021, it accelerated the ongoing decline in population growth as opposed to causing a net loss in population like the Black Plague did.
Mm-hmm.
COVID did decrease life expectancy by 1.6 years, but even that made only a minor dent in the progress made between 1950 and 2021, when global life expectancy rose from 49 to 71.7 years. Back when the world's women averaged 5 or more children, high mortality kept population growth under control. But now it's low fertility rates that keep population growth in check. The demographer Jennifer Schuba described the phenomenon of declining population this way, quote, "What we are experiencing now and have been experiencing for decades is something that we have not seen before in human history, which is a large-scale, cross-national, cross-cultural shift towards preferring and having smaller families," end quote. For anyone who wants to dig deeper, I'll post some charts to our Facebook page showing fertility rates by country over time, based on data from the UN and other sources. The pace of the decline of global fertility rates has increased in recent decades. In the 19th century, it took the US 82 years and the UK 95 years to reduce their fertility rates from over 6 to under 3, whereas it took China only 11 years, from 1967 to 1978, to shrink its rate from over 6 to under 3. And that's before the Chinese government implemented its one-child policy between 1979 and 2015. Which suggests to me that a heavy-handed intervention wasn't even necessary.
Right. And in fact, that intervention is somewhat regretted now, as China is encouraging its population to have more babies, and yet their fertility rate continues to decline.
Yes, and we're going to talk about why that happens too, that phenomenon. Let me just say before we get to interpretation, in Iran, it took only 10 years for the fertility rate to shrink from above 6 to under 3. And that change took place in 1986 to 1996. In both Iran and China today, the rate is under 2, similar to the United States.
So it's interesting that the decline in fertility in Iran was experienced roughly a decade into the very conservative clerical regime leading that country. I would have expected the reverse, but no.
Yes. You know, just as a side thing, Iranian history is fascinating, and the Iranian people fascinate me because they're so sophisticated by so many of these kind of metrics, and yet they live in one of the most backward states in the world. That's a potential subject for a future mansplaining podcast, I think.
Indeed, yeah. And hopefully not foreshadowing for the United States of an advanced society living underneath a backwards regime.
Yeah, good point. And I'm actually going to say something about that too later in this podcast. Like global population increase, global fertility decline is also a good thing because it reflects some positive trends in society. First and foremost is the empowerment of women, primarily through increased access to education, from simple literacy to higher education. Economist Gary Becker of our alma mater theorized that the more education a woman receives, the higher her opportunity cost for having children. Female empowerment and self-fulfillment also leads to increased participation in labor markets, which of course comes from having more education, and increased ability to decide whether and when to have children, thanks to better access to contraception and family planning services.
Yeah. You could say that this current age is the first time that women have really had a choice between a life in which their primary role is mother versus a life in which their primary role is something else that they choose for themselves.
Absolutely true. For the first time in the history of humanity, the correlation between how much education a woman gets and how many kids she has is so strong that it looks like causation, an argument that some scholars are now starting to make. It's no coincidence that in the country today with the world's highest fertility rate, Niger in Africa, women average only 1 year of education. As women's autonomy grows throughout the world, lower fertility rates get locked in.
Mm-hmm.
A second positive trend reinforcing the decline in global fertility is the increased status and well-being of children, which is seen particularly in declining rates of child mortality. In a place and time where there's high child mortality, women will give birth to more children than they necessarily want to ensure against the loss of children. The demographic term for this behavior is child hoarding. To put this in perspective for our listeners who might think child hoarding is crazy, in the pre-modern world, more than a third of children died before they were 5 years old. Lower child mortality means that women don't have to overcompensate to reach the number of children they want. Another factor is that as economies modernized and urbanized by moving from farm fields to city factories, the need for child labor decreased and was later restricted in many places. With parents no longer benefiting from their children's contributions to household income, the opportunity cost for having children rose, further lowering fertility rates. And finally, as many of us with kids know all too well, educating and raising children is very costly, and so parents with limited resources think long and hard about how many kids to have.
Yeah.
All these trends I just mentioned gradually become cultural norms and reinforce themselves across generations, securing longer-term, lower fertility. This is a really important point, and I'll give a simple example to illustrate it. Whereas it would not have been unusual for our grandparents' or great-grandparents' generations to have 6 or 8 kids in a family, today it's the norm to have 2 kids or fewer. People see this norm portrayed on TV and in social media, and it shapes their behavior.
Right. Do you remember shows in the 70s, The Waltons, and
Yes.
8 is Enough,
Yes.
where the entire basis of the show was just this enormous family with so many children. And that was really the premise, is that happy families are big families.
Yes. And of course, the Brady Bunch was a mixed family, but that's still 6 kids.
Right.
Yeah. We've been talking about global fertility up to now, but I also checked the National Center for Health Statistics data for U.S. fertility rates by state for the year 2022, the most recent year we have data for. Mark, would you like to guess the most and least fertile states in the U.S.?
For most fertile, I'm going to guess Arkansas.
Okay.
And for least fertile, I'm going to go with Massachusetts.
2 good guesses, and you're kind of close geographically and culturally. I'll explain. South Dakota leads the nation in fertility, and Vermont, with a pathetic 1.36, is bringing up the rear.
I was going to guess Vermont, and I talked myself out of it.
Yeah. I compared the 2022 numbers to 2005, the earliest year displayed on the page, and Utah led the nation, with Vermont again finishing dead last.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Utah's understandable with Mormons and their big families.
Yes, you anticipated what I was just about to say. Now, don't quote me on this because I didn't look this up, but I'm guessing that the Mormons must have discovered birth control sometime after 2005. As for the women of Vermont, all that maple syrup must be getting into their fallopian tubes and gumming things up.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the medical explanation.
Another interesting thing I noticed in the state-by-state data is that the fertility rates in the 2022 map closely track the electoral map in recent presidential elections, with higher fertility in red states and lower fertility in blue states. Given the strong correlation between education and fertility rates that I mentioned earlier, I compared the U.S. fertility map to U.S. News & World Report's latest rankings of the best states for educational attainment, which measures the share of people 25 and older in each state who have an associate's degree or higher. And it loosely tracks the fertility map, with low fertility Vermont ranked number 3 in education, high fertility South Dakota ranked in the middle of the pack, and 9 of the bottom 10 in educational attainment being higher fertility red states, including Arkansas that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Now, surely religion and culture also play a part in fertility rates, but the education correlation seems to hold true.
With minds like steel traps, bargain joy here to discern the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. And explain, it's a calling and they do it for you. Explain me, baby, explain, it's a calling that you don't do it too.
Now let's move on to what all this data portends for the future. First, as you suggested in your question, the so-called baby bust is hanging like an anvil over the world economy. The fertility rate in the 15 largest economies in the world, measured by GDP, are all currently below the 2.1 replacement rate. And that's not just the US, EU, and places like Japan and Italy that are notorious for their aging populations. It's also Mexico, Thailand, and Brazil. Not to mention India and China, which between the two of them account for over a third of the world's population. Smaller workforces are coming soon to a country near you. As the workforce gradually declines, the total size of a nation's economy will also decline, barring some unlikely spike in worker productivity, which I think is unlikely because we've squeezed every last ounce out of productivity in recent decades. Having fewer workers creates numerous economic problems, the most obvious being the difficulty of supporting retirees who draw their Social Security and health insurance benefits from workers and rely on younger relatives to care for them.
Yeah.
The developed world currently has about 3 people aged 20 to 64 for every person 65 and older. But by 2050, that number will shrink below 2. Labor shortages are likely to lead to budget crises, rectified by some combination of higher taxes on the working population and a higher retirement age. An older population is more risk-averse and less inclined toward growth, which is already affecting housing policy in many places via NIMBYism, which is largely an old person's disease. The coming new normal of fewer younger workers also leads to a drain on what's called fluid intelligence, the ability to think creatively and develop innovative breakthrough solutions to entrenched problems, which is the province of young people.
Let me interject. It's not always the province of young people. I've always found that a little bit irritating. It might be more prevalent among young people, but that does not mean that an older person cannot be innovative.
Yes. Point well taken. You're right. But here's another problem. Though fertility rates are declining everywhere, they're not declining evenly. The share of the world's births in low education, low income areas is expected to nearly double from 18% to 35% between 2021 and the end of the century, with sub-Saharan Africa alone accounting for half the children born in the world by 2100.
Wow.
That shift will create a demographic division between richer countries with aging populations and declining workforces, and poorer countries with higher birth rates that strain their already inadequate resources, many of them located in the parts of the world most vulnerable to poverty, famine, the lack of potable water, political instability, and climate change. What might we do to address these consequences on the horizon? Here's some ideas. In countries with sub-replacement level fertility, more open immigration policies would beef up labor force participation. Poorer countries might someday be able to leverage that by negotiating fair and ethical migration policies so that, for example, their people are allowed to migrate to the developed world in exchange for financial aid from the host countries. Alas, in the current climate of right-wing demonization of immigrants, the worldwide trend is toward closing borders.
Right. And even moving forward on child labor legislation to allow underage workers to work in factories to replace those immigrants who you don't want to be here.
Yes, yes. You know, robust immigration is the U.S.'s greatest advantage in a world of population decline. But we'll soon see if the dumb as shit MAGA coalition convinces us to squander our advantage.
Mm-hmm.
The demographer Lyman Stone, writing in The Atlantic, proposes policies like boosting the educational and professional attainment of men, which makes them more attractive to women as potential partners with which to raise a family, or eliminating marriage penalties like the one in which low-income people lose their housing or food stamp benefits when they combine their incomes.
Wait a minute. Did I hear that correctly? Is that the proposal is to make men more attractive to convince women to have children?
Yes, by boosting their economic prospects.
Yeah, okay. That seems odd to me. Does it seem perfectly straightforward to you? Is it just me?
Yeah, I mean, I got so steeped in listening, like I listened to a long interview with that demographer, and it kind of makes sense when he lays out all the context.
Yeah. I mean, at least he's recommending that we make these men more educated and better earners to attract these women. Yeah, he's not saying that we should make gym memberships free so that the more muscular men attract the women. But the basic premise is that the women would otherwise choose to pursue careers of their own, but we're convincing them to be mothers by making the men more attractive. That seems quirky to me.
Well, I mean, also implicit in his analysis, and which is shared by many other demographers, is the ship has sailed on low fertility, right?
Yeah.
Convincing women to have more babies or doing things to incentivize them is not going to work. So making their potential partners more attractive to them might work. I think that's the idea behind the proposal.
Okay.
In some countries where men take a more active role in raising children and women don't exclusively suffer from the pay gap caused by leaving the workforce to raise kids, fertility rates are higher. Whereas in countries like Japan, where childcare falls disproportionately on the backs of women, fertility is especially low. Regarding the brain drain caused by having fewer younger workers, some scholars believe artificial intelligence, a frequent topic of this podcast, might come in handy.
Mm.
To the extent AI generates new ideas for policymakers, there's less need for human incubators.
Right.
In addition, AI-powered robotics might make it less labor-intensive to care for the elderly.
Yeah, that's been the thought that's been in the back of my mind for much of what you've been talking through, which is that there are two things that could totally disrupt all of the planning around future fertility and gross domestic product. And one is AI and the other is automation.
Yes.
Which are two potential sledgehammers headed for our economies.
Yes, as we've discussed in prior episodes.
Absolutely. And which between the two of them could completely reshape the way the economy works. And human fertility might become much less important in terms of driving those sorts of things.
Yes.
But that's a big unknown. So unless we want to just shrug our shoulders on this episode and say we don't really know, it's not really a fruitful area of conversation, but it's going to certainly be influential.
Yes. And I at least wanted to mark it here because I think AI is going to play a part in the future of fertility.
Yeah.
It's true that many people tell pollsters that they want more children than they have, which suggests that the fertility level might be lower than it could or should be. There are a few reasons posed for this inefficiency, including worldwide housing shortages, inadequate treatments for infertility, and the prohibitive cost of raising kids that I mentioned earlier, which was estimated in 2022, by the way, at nearly $400,000 per child in the U.S. through age 17, which doesn't include college tuition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's anecdotal testimony, but some of what I've heard from women in my life is not that they definitely had a plan for the number of children they wanted to have and pursued that plan, but that you have a limited opportunity to have a child, biologically speaking, and it's never clear when to make that choice. So sometimes you end up with few or none children simply because of the way things played out instead of as a result of conscious decisions that you made.
Yes.
It's more a function of chance and missed opportunity than it is just a decision to exit the role of mother.
Yes. And I would add to that, as religion and culture basically take more of a back seat in modern society and more things like economic anxiety take the foreground, it's no surprise that women will make the decisions that you just said.
Right, right. Or just not know which decision to make sometimes, be torn between competing decisions, and as a result, just not make the decision in time.
Yes. Pronatal policies like paid parental leave, baby bonds, universal pre-K, student debt forgiveness, changes to zoning laws to create more housing. All those things would certainly make the U.S. a more livable place for parents and children. But there's little data to suggest that they actually increase fertility. And this surprised me, Mark.
Yeah.
For example, Singapore gives young families tax rebates, cash grants, and childcare subsidies, but its fertility rate is still 1.0. Researchers have quantified the net effect of pronatal policies as producing about 0.2 additional live births per woman, which is not a lot of bang for the buck.
Yeah.
And speaking of the effect of cash on fertility, economists studying lottery winners in Sweden and the US wondered whether the infusion of cash stimulated fertility. Answer? Not really. While men who hit the lottery tended to get married and have kids, women tended to get divorced.
Oh, that's...
Get rid of that schmuck.
Yeah, that's a sad commentary, but I guess it is what it is.
Yes. And even if pronatal policies did provably more to increase fertility in rich countries, the modernization of the third world and women's improved access to education and contraception in those places points to a continued decline of global fertility below replacement rate. In your question, Mark, you mentioned that not too long ago we were worried about the opposite problem of too many people, not too few. I want to tell that story because I think it's a cautionary tale that might help us to put the prospect of negative population growth in perspective. In 1968, a Stanford entomologist, yes, entomologist, this guy studied butterflies, named Paul Ehrlich, published a book called The Population Bomb that sold millions of copies and became one of the 20th century's most influential books. In it, Ehrlich argued that we were living on a dying planet in which, quote, hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death, end quote, as unchecked population growth exhausted the Earth's resources. It listed pollution, famine, and social and ecological collapse as the possible consequences of overpopulation. Ehrlich's goal in writing the book was to mainstream the idea of population control, but it inadvertently dovetailed with the nascent environmental movement and became a cause célèbre for millions of people. Ehrlich became a celebrity, and in 1970 he told CBS News, quote, sometime in the next 15 years, the end will come. And by the end, I mean an utter breakdown of the capacity of the planet to support humanity, end quote. Though Ehrlich's book generated furious pushback from scientists who pointed out that the sheer number of people in the world matters less than how many resources they use, it galvanized a wave of alarm and spawned a worldwide anti-population growth movement in the 1970s and 1980s. That's what you and I grew up in.
Right.
Entities from Planned Parenthood to the World Bank to the United Nations began funding and promoting programs to reduce fertility in poor countries, which had the unintended consequence of abetting human rights abuses. For example, in Pakistan, Egypt, Tunisia, Taiwan, and South Korea, the salaries of health workers were tied to how many IUDs they inserted into women's uteruses.
Mm.
And even worse, in places like India, Bolivia, Peru, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Mexico, millions of people were sterilized, often coercively, sometimes illegally, and frequently in unsafe conditions.
Yeah.
Indira Gandhi's India required men and women to submit to sterilization to get staple goods like electricity, water, and medical care, and teachers were encouraged to expel students from school if their parents weren't sterilized. China's one-child policy that I mentioned earlier led to as many as 100 million coerced abortions, plus millions more forced sterilizations. Ehrlich strongly supported population control measures, including sterilization, and he also encouraged the U.S. to pressure other countries to launch vasectomy campaigns. Though in fairness, he was aghast at the targeted brutality of many countries' programs.
Yeah. It's awfully easy for population control to verge off into areas that start to feel like eugenics or racism or classism, where there's a perspective that the wrong people are having babies because, of course, poor people tend to be having more children than the wealthier families. And so it can so easily go off into unsavory and, in retrospect, shocking behavior on the part of authorities.
Yes, and in fact, that was one of the suspicions of Paul Ehrlich, is that he just wanted to get rid of the quote-unquote wrong people. Yes, You're quite right about that. I think the tale of Paul Ehrlich and the overpopulation movement has something to say to us today. After all, its logic still seems to dominate many conversations about population and fertility. Environmentalists and others loudly argue against pronatal policies as if they think overpopulation is the problem, when in fact it's the opposite. We can now safely say that the specter of imminent overpopulation not only wasn't true, but it led to panic, overreaction, and some downright cruel outcomes.
Yeah.
Growing populations didn't create mass famine. In fact, according to the UN, in the 50-plus years since the population bomb appeared, the number of hungry people in the world declined from 1 in 4 to 1 in 10, even though the world's population more than doubled in that same period.
Yeah.
That irrational panic and overreaction is worth remembering when you hear people like Elon Musk say things like, quote, "If people don't have more children, civilization is going to crumble," end quote. Jennifer Schuba, the demographer I quoted earlier about population decline, sees 3 possible scenarios for the future. Admittedly, the first 2 aren't rosy. The first is maintaining, either through willful ignorance or inertia, the status quo of economic policies reliant on continued population growth, with some ineffective pronatal policy sprinkled in here and there. This might happen, but I have faith that governments and their citizens will move away from what's no longer working. The second is reacting with panic and fear about population decline, much as we did with population overflow 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Surrendering to xenophobic nationalism by turning against historically helpful measures like increased immigration, and shifting government policy toward restricting access to abortion and contraceptives and coercing women into having more children. That reads to me like a page from the Republican platform for this year's presidential race.
Yeah.
Given the rightward turn of much of the world's politics and the not insubstantial prospect of that fucking guy being restored to the White House, this outcome is a real possibility. The third scenario is where we calmly realize that lower fertility is here to stay. It has many salutary benefits, like empowering women and children, reducing carbon emissions, and alleviating the strain on global resources. And we challenge ourselves to become resilient enough to adapt to that new reality. It should come as no surprise that I vote for door number 3.
Mm-hmm.
And to that last point, I want to close with a cogent observation made by Darrell Bricker and John Ibbotson, the authors of a 2019 book called Empty Planet, The Shock of Global Population Decline, that my wife recommended to me. Really good read, by the way. It makes plain that the world of population decline that we're bequeathing to our children and grandchildren is not a catastrophe. In fact, quote, it will be cleaner, safer, quieter. The oceans will start to heal and the atmosphere cool, or at least stop heating. People may not be growing wealthier, but that might not matter so much. Power centers will shift, and centers of innovation and creativity too. We will live in a world of cities with less and less in between. Population decline will not exclusively determine our future, but it will help to shape it. End quote. That's a future I'm willing to sign up for. How about you, Mark?
Yeah, I do certainly see potential benefit to population decline if it is managed in an intelligent way. And like you, I'm concerned that it will generate sort of panicky and reactionary responses. So fingers crossed that we don't.
Yes, because we just saw this happen 50 years ago with the population bomb. So
yeah, exactly.
Yes,
so.
It is going to happen again. We can almost predict it.
Yeah. And as for the economist sounding the alarm about population decline, I've always wondered how much of that perspective is just driven by this insistence on that productivity number going up as a necessity instead of allowing for the possibility that humans can flourish in different circumstances.
Yes.
Where, like, maybe from a certain perspective, the only proper function of the economy is to go up. Like, GDP always needs to rise. And so anything that contributes to a decline in GDP is cause for alarm. But in the larger scheme of things, maybe it's not that much of an issue at all. And in terms of productivity in particular, as something that is supposed to just constantly go up, I've never really understood that. If the only outcome of productivity rises is greater productivity, and you're not tying that to any notion of social or human good. And I could imagine a world in which productivity goes down, but the fruits of that productivity are more evenly distributed. And on a grand scale, the human outcome would actually be superior within that scenario.
Yes, good points all. I suspect that the future generation of economists, or perhaps some young economists who are already theorizing this, are going to come up with ways to explain a world of less growth, but still a successful and optimal world nonetheless. I think that's inevitable. And also, as you were speaking, I was thinking about prior episodes we've done on things like climate change and how it might change economies, where you can't get that kiwi from New Zealand at your local bodega counter, right? Because supply chains have changed and it's gotten too expensive to ship it, right? Mm-hmm. But there'll be a thriving local economy where you'll get local apples, or something like that instead of the kiwi, and things will be just fine. And there might be many more benefits besides the climate benefits, the benefit of supporting local agriculture instead of supporting New Zealand's agriculture. That might be good for the local economy. So I think the future is going to be full of reevaluations like we both just said.
Mm-hmm. I will say one thing that surprised me, but is very helpful in terms of thinking about this, is that the time frame for population decline on a global scale is much broader than I thought, because you said it was at the end of this century.
Yes.
So basically 75 years from now.
Yes.
And take it from me, folks, a whole lot of stuff is going to happen within those 75 years because the rate of change technologically and economically within the Western world has been accelerating for the past 100 years.
Yes.
So we can't even accurately predict what's going to happen to our economies in the next 10 years.
That's
right. So if you're looking at fertility and trying to forecast its impacts 75 years from now,
Yes.
you don't know what's going to happen. Like, you can think about what might happen, but there is no way to plan for that. There'll be a lot of really important things that are going to happen between now and when the population begins to decline. So maybe we just need to see how things go.
Yeah, and just to pluck one out of thin air, or one we've discussed many, many times on this podcast, if artificial general intelligence comes before the population starts shrinking, who knows what effect that will have on that trajectory.
And there are people in the AI community who say that AGI will never happen, but of those who do believe that it's going to happen, the general consensus is it's going to happen somewhere around 2050, 2060, so well in advance. So yes. And then everything changes when that happens.
Right.
So this is probably not a problem that humanity is going to need to confront, because the rules of the game will have changed before that happens.
Yeah, and I think one of the through lines of all my research is that we can call it a problem, but we should also have faith in ourselves that we will figure out a way, because humans have always figured out a way to deal with the pressing problems in the here and now.
Right.
And I'm confident humans will find a way to deal with this.
Yeah. The thought I'm left with is that the biological imperative is kind of giving away to a different imperative, which is that the biological imperative that we're all taught about in genetics classes in college is simply to reproduce. Put enough copies of your DNA out there that some then will survive to reproductive age and that your genes will survive. And so that biological incentive is just to make a bunch of babies. And here in Seattle, the creature that's doing that most successfully right now is rabbits. Suddenly there are rabbits all over Seattle. They're doing a great job of reproducing. But humans as a species, technologically, culturally, intellectually, we're reaching a point where our own incentives are not aligned with the incentives of our genes. And I think that's interesting that we can sort of transcend biology at a certain point and think of our lives as something other than simply making copies of ourselves.
Yeah. Rabbits with bigger brains can do that.
Yeah. Rabbits have not yet reached stage 4+.
So thanks again for this question. It was fascinating for me. I hope my presentation was interesting to you.
It was, yes. Definitely a big picture question to ponder, and those are my favorite ones.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I have a question for you for next time. You ready?
I look forward to it.
All right. This question is one that I've had in my pocket for a while, but I'm pulling it out now because of the U.S. Supreme Court's 2 recent controversial opinions on presidential immunity and the administrative state. Both greatly increase the power of the executive branch generally and the president specifically. And the intellectual foundation of both appears to be a theory of constitutional law called the unitary executive theory. I know conservatives have been advocating for increased presidential power for decades, but with a 6-3 SCOTUS supermajority now locked in place for the foreseeable future, it looks like they're finally poised to transform the unitary executive from theory into reality. So it's time the rest of us knew more about it. Mark, what exactly is the unitary executive theory, and should we be concerned about its ascendance?
Okay, good question. I will say I'm starting from zero on this because the first time I heard that phrase was when you said it about 15 or 20 seconds ago. So interesting. So I will be writing upon a blank sheet of paper and we'll see where I end up with that.
You clearly don't listen to as much panicky liberal talk as I do, or you would have heard that a while ago.
Yeah, I might have opted out of those conversations in search of a more serene existence.
Probably a good decision.
Okay, so I'll be looking for that. And with that, I signal the close of this episode. If you were interested in anything that Joe said and you'd like to follow up on his sources, do some investigation of your own, you can find all of the sources posted to our Facebook page. You can find that at Mansplaining the Podcast on Facebook. We post there for every episode. Every now and then we come back and we post a follow-up story if there's something in the news that reminds us of an episode. It's a good place to say, hey, I liked this episode, or hey, you left this out. We read all your comments. We respond to all of them. So please do engage with that. If posting to Facebook is not your thing, and no judgment, it's not really my thing either, you can leave us a voicemail at the number of 206-486-4074. You can call and yell at us there. No one has done that yet. You could be the first. You can call and leave us a question there, and we can turn it into a future episode. Again, no one has done that yet, but you could be the first.
Just don't bemoan your own fertility. That's the one thing we don't want you to do.
Yeah, we don't have any answers for you, really, about whether or not you should be having children at this point in your life. Really, that's a conversation for you and the other people in your life. But if you have a question about a future episode, we'd love to hear about it. If you would like to help other people discover this podcast and become a member of the mansplaining community, you can do that by leaving us a rating or a review on your podcast player of choice, be it Google or Spotify or Apple or Amazon or YouTube, wherever you found this. Leave us a rating, talk about what you like about the podcast. It really does help people discover mansplaining. So I will leave that to you, our listeners, to compose your review. I'm sure it will take you most of the next 2 weeks to get those words just right. In the meantime, I'll be researching the next topic. We'll bring the results back to you. And until then, I have been Mark, and that has been Joe, and we'll see you then.
Talk to you next time.
Studs and bitches are mad. What the hell are we supposed to do? Try to avoid one, the recipe for fun, the number of buns in each oven. It's 2.1 when all is said and done, the figure that's proper for loving. One kid can be seen but not felt. 3 kids pull out the chastity belt. 2 kids close but no cigar. That extra 0.1, not a daughter or son, but an AI avatar. Whoa. Try 2.1, the recipe for fun, the number of buns in each oven. It's 2.1 when all is said and done, the figure that's proper for loving. What's the magic number? Is there a master plan? Trying to balance life in this crowded land. Every choice we make, every life we grow, shapes the future, don't you know? Numbers climbing, futures designing, game of choices has a line is our 2.1, the recipe for fun, the number of buns in each oven. It's 2.1 when all is said and done, the figure that's proper for loving. 2.1, 2.1.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.